All right. So we're going to start going down the requested questions now. We're doing these roughly in order, basically the order I received them in. I've already gotten quite a few questions, so we're going to be tackling these basically every week for the next infinite period of time. But I want to clarify something. I've mentioned before that these questions will be in character answers, as in this is what the audience and the players are aware of as of this point in the campaign. So I've already gotten at least 3 questions that I'm aware of that don't fit into that purview. For example, let's say, to use a Star Wars example, to go back to that, let's say, let's say we're at the beginning of New Hope and we're going through it, and some person asks the question, okay, what is happening on Alderaan right now before it gets destroyed? Or, who is Luke's father? These kind of questions, and the answer is going to be, you don't know yet. So for questions like those, obviously I'm just skipping over them, but I wanted to let you guys know that I'm skipping over them so that you don't ask them and don't wonder why it is I'm not answering your question. So for all 3 of those, the answer to all of them universally is, you don't know. Now, golems. Golems are what was requested to talk about first. Now, golems are kind of a unique form of magic technology. They are I'm not even sure where to start. Okay, a golem in this setting is a chunk of mass which is held together by a single, incredibly powerful, magically woven core. Now that mass is the entirety of the mass of the golem is also woven, so that the matter that makes up the golem is effectively fluidic. In other words, a golem made of wood or rock or granite or whatever, that granite could move perfectly as if it was liquid. It can be completely controlled 100% absolutely with near perfect precision. So to explain what I mean a bit, it's not just a golem that can smash its hand into a building or whatever. If a golem needed to work in a laboratory with delicate vials and whatnot, it could, because it can control how much pressure it protrudes. So it could literally lower its hand and basically morph the hand around the vials it needs to hold, clench around them just a bit and pick them up and do whatever it needs to do with them. It is very precise, and that's one of the reasons golems are so valuable, because they're not just massive brutes. Now, golems are kind of unique because, again, the entirety of the mass of the golem is woven in addition to the core of the golem, and neither of these work without the other. It takes a huge amount of power, magical power, in order to weave into it, and a ridiculous amount of time in order to constantly weave it. The way most golems are constructed in the modern era, that's going to be more relevant later, but give me a moment, is you have entire teams of arc weavers who get there and weave basically all of their energy into the golem until they're completely spent. And then they have to go and recoup, try and recover, try and refine themselves to the point where they can actually function, come back and go back to weaving in it. So it rotates. In other words, you have a few in, and then you have the next group come in, the next group, and the next group. So there's a constant stream of woven energy being put into the golem, and it takes months of this to get to the energy requirements. There are certain individuals who can simply weave golems, but when I say individuals, I mean I can think of 3 off the top of my head in the entire setting who actually have that kind of power. One of them's dead. So So golems, like I said, can be very specific. The material a golem is made of is very relevant. It determines, in a weird way, the power of the golem, and it's kind of a weird thing, because you have to put certain types of material are more or less conductive towards magic and towards weaving specifically. And thus, if you have a golem made of more difficult material, it requires more energy and more power to weave into it, which makes the subsequent golem itself stronger, and the matter that it contains it stronger. Because, I mean, obviously a rock golem is probably going to be a little more durable than a wood golem because of the material difference, but it's also going to be more durable because there's more magic keeping that golem functioning. Remember the morphic fluidic thing? That's basically because the matter is being rearranged more or less on a molecular level constantly, and the amount of energy required to do that basically presents a sort of magical field which maintains the shell, the casing of the golem, and that shell is stronger based on the greater strength of the golem. So a golem is actually technically stronger twice, once because of simply having stronger material in some cases, because some material is actually much more. We'll get to that in a minute. And in the other case, because of the fact that the golem has so much more energy in it. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean by the other thing. Silver is very resistant to weaving. Actually, silver, copper, and gold all are, as well as platinum, and basically all the gemstones. Oh, not all the all the super rare gemstones. So, for example, if you had a silver golem, it would technically actually be weaker than in terms of pure physical material than most other golems, like a granite golem or an obsidian golem, because silver is this mushy material, right? But the massive amount of power required to simply weave that much magic into silver means it would still be a stronger golem than a granite golem in terms of durability and in terms of what it can do. It's also worth noting golems in general can cast. That's kind of, well, let's talk about the differences in golems. There's generally considered to be two types of golems. There's actually three, and the party's aware of this now, so I can tell you this. There's pharaoh golems, there is modern golems, and then there's the third category, which doesn't really have a title per se. A pharaoh golem is any golem that is found in the wild. There are quite a few of these. There have been quite a few of these over the years. Back in the day, quite a few feral golems were found in what is now known as civilized territory. These golems have since been destroyed. In some of the more wild areas, including the Osteth, the Dyers, the Crater region, and Stonehold, there are still feral golems just kind of hanging out. Feral golems are almost universally made of stronger materials than the kind most modern people can make. Like I said, the stronger, the more resistant to magic the material is, the more power it is required, the more energy, the more difficult it is required to make that golem. In modern age time, it is basically considered impossible to go past wooden, literally a lumber golem for all intents and purposes. They can do sand, they can do mud, they can do water, and they can do lumber. And lumber is like the top end, and even then it is possible for a lumber golem to fail in its construction, because while you're constructing it, you have to maintain a level of energy being poured into it through weaving. If you don't, all that energy is released and collapses, and it basically self-destructs. You're back to ground zero. And you generally lose all the material that was put into making the golem, and you definitely lose the core as well. I haven't talked about the core much. The core is ironically one of the easiest parts of the golem to construct. It is merely an extremely advanced form of Magitech, as opposed to the rest of the thing, which takes months and months of constant cohesive weaving. You can see why I say it's easier like that. I should put my phone on mute just in case I get... That's happened today. Here we go. So the core is completely reverse engineered. Most people don't actually know how to make a core. They only know how to reproduce a core. They don't know how it works or why it works, to be blunt. But people have salvaged cores from feral golems in the last few centuries and basically figured out how to construct new ones, and that's how they are. Cores were also the first form of magic technology that the modern races of the Five Nations actually ever encountered. At least they're aware of. This was well before airships started being uncovered, of the psionic airships. So, the next thing to be noted about golems is how feral golems act. Feral golems are... They sit exactly where they are, and they're effectively motionless. Most people don't actually think they can move at all because they're not moving even a tiny little bit. Not even 1 gram of them is functional until something enters their threat radius, which is what it's considered to be. Basically, a golem will plant itself somewhere, a feral golem will plant itself somewhere, and there's a radius. This is a full 3D, it's like a sphere around it, and if something enters it, it will detect it and go straight towards it and immediately put all of its energy and effort into destroying whatever that is as brutally and as quickly as possible, and then it will go back to its base point. In most cases, these feral golems will actually stop chasing the thing if the thing leaves their radius. Feral golems in general are very fast and very strong. Even a simple water golem could probably level an entire town without much trouble, and that's what the entire armed guard going after it the entire time. So, some people have wondered how the party was able to take out a water golem, in addition to the fact that it was like 12 leveled adventurers. There are a couple other reasons why that water golem was weaker than it otherwise would be. I don't want to diminish their accomplishment. It was still a very close fight for them, and they nearly died. And they blew weeklies to bring that thing down. But they did manage it, so, credit where credit is due. But I deliberately did something to make the water golem slightly less deadly because of how incredibly dangerous golems in general are. Now, Most people assume that feral golems just go into kind of a default protection mode, like because they lack orders or something. But no one's really 100% sure why or how this happens, because modern golems, the second category, can do this. It's like literally about a 1 in 10,000 chance. There have only been a handful of examples of this happening across all of history. But every now and again, every once in a couple decades, several decades, a constructed golem, one of the modern golems, will just randomly go feral. And again, we'll just pulverize anything and everything within the radius of wherever it went feral, and it'll just sit there, just like a normal feral golem will. They then have to send in expert people. This is one of the things the third wing of the Order does, for example. They'll send in people to take this golem down and try to salvage its core if they can. If not, they just need to destroy the thing before it causes more damage and hurts people. Despite this, because of the extreme rarity, most people still cherish and value golems, and it's pretty obvious why. These things are incredibly useful. They're useful for precision, they're useful for defense, they're useful for offense. Before anybody asks, so far no golems have been employed in the war, for the same reason you're probably already thinking. Most people who have access to golems are the rich individuals or certain high-valued organizations that are using them for their own purposes. Most governments don't actually employ golems in their military because of the insane cost and expense and time investment required to make a golem, even a basic golem. And so having those around in the military is simply infeasible. By contrast, the airships provide benefit other than big thing to hit things, and therefore are easier to justify in the budget. Now that the war started, we'll see if that keeps going. However, there is one other niggle. Or naggle? Sniggle? There's one other problem in this. The Order is the only organization in the modern era that knows how to make golems. 100% of the modern golems are constructed by the Order. Again, that water golem I mentioned earlier was a golem the Order was constructing that went feral. That's not what actually happened, but whatever. So that's that's kind of how that works out. So it's you can see why it would be difficult to coerce the Order into providing a killing machine for any given side. The only way that would ever work is if they were willing to basically buy golems for each of the sides involved, which is unlikely given the ridiculous expense involved. And that's assuming they could even convince the Order to sell golems to a military to begin with, which has never happened before, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I mentioned the third type of golem. These are modern constructed golems that are nevertheless... most people don't actually know who made them. Nobody knows who made them other than me, of course. But they are still... they have the qualities... Okay, I mentioned feral golems. There's one other thing that defines a feral golem. They're made of more difficult stuff than the modern ones are. So whoever made those was obviously much more skilled and much more advanced in terms of magic technology and weaving, right? So all modern golems are inherently weaker than those by default. These new golems are much, much stronger than the feral golems, and yet still have all the precision and control of the other ones, and can cast and use magic freely. They actually have unique abilities that were woven directly into them, along with a few other things that make them unique. These include the diamond, emerald, ruby, sapphire, and topaz, I believe, golems that the party encountered on Erlen's Lacelle. Golems that were recently created, but they have no idea whom by, and were made of some of the most difficult stuff around to weave. Now, as an aside, just really quick, you'll notice I mentioned gold, silver, and copper as some of the things that are extremely hard to weave, including as well as platinum and diamond. This is actually, I'll talk more about the currency in some future thing, because I know it's probably going to be asked about, but this is one of the reasons why it is that those are used as currency, because they're worthless. They're worthless for actual, weaponry or utility. They're worthless for weaving. And so the decision was made when the Darkcost Accords were ratified, because before that they just used whatever currency, in order to use those four metals as valuable metals and establish that new currency system, specifically because that way the currency would be tied up solely as currency and would have no factual value. It was a way to check and balance the system, which may or may not have worked. We'll talk about that whenever we get to that discussion. One other thing about golems. It is, of course, possible to destroy golems, but it is also possible for an intelligent golem to, for lack of a better word, play dead. To look like it's reverting to a state and then just be like, and then to go inactive. But it's very, very difficult to tell if that golem is still active. It would require a master weaver or someone very, very skilled in Arcana in order to be able to tell if that golem is active or not. I mention this because I don't mind saying, especially since the party's kind of found out about this by now, the golems I mentioned earlier that reverted to chests that they then sold for ridiculous amounts of money were still active. They were playing dead. They have other orders, don't worry. So that's it on golems. Any questions about golems specifically, feel free to put in here. I'm going to go ahead and look at my next question and go ahead and answer that for next week. See you around.